Jungle heat. A narrow track cuts through elephant grass near Myatka, Burma, August 1944. An American patrol freezes at the mouth of a bamboo compound, rows of windowless stalls, a tin basin, the sour tang of antiseptic. A door opens. A girl, no, a woman who looks like a girl, flinches at the sight of uniforms. She's been told monsters are coming. She doesn't run. She can't. She doesn't believe freedom exists. Narration. Liberation doesn't arrive with trumpet blasts. It arrives with the smell of mildew and carbolic, with ledgers and rubber stamps, with women who don't lift their eyes because they've learned the cost of being noticed. When American units reached Matkina after a 78-day grind, they didn't just overrun a position. They crossed into a hidden logistics network, one so ordinary in its paperwork that its purpose felt impossible: sexual slavery scaled to an army. The interrogations that followed, catalogued by psychological warfare teams and intelligence sections, were dry, almost boring on the page. Names, ages, ports of embarkation, the falsified promises of factory work in Singapore. But behind each line item was a geography of harm: Rangoon transit sheds, guarded trucks up to the Burmese frontier, a list of amenities that meant assault scheduled like mess call. What the women described shattered the idea that this was rogue behavior. It was regulated. It was inspected. It was planned. A month later and a world away, in Yunnan, Chinese soldiers lead 4 Korean women toward a camera. One is visibly pregnant. The shutter snaps. On film, it looks like rescue. In memory, it felt like stepping into a different kind of uncertainty. The photograph would live in an archive for decades before the woman's name, Park Young-sim, could be spoken in a room where she would be believed. 60 years is a long time for truth to wait. Intelligence people are trained to notice the boring things: forms in triplicate, seals, routing slips. They noticed. A translator under a tent lamp turns a placard that reads "Comfort Facility" into what it really says, "Rape Station." He writes "Special Service Personnel" and quietly knows it means women who won't be paid. He translates a medical log, condoms issued by rank, treatment that often meant forced abortion, sanitation day that meant inspections, threats, and doses of caustic chemicals. The words were careful. The reality was not. If you want to know whether a system is unofficial, look for chaos. If you want to know whether it's policy, look for consistency. From Nanjing to Mandalay, consistency held. Opening hours, price tables, doctors' signatures, transport orders that routed human beings like crates of rations, rail slips that moved women in freight cars labeled as military cargo. In every theatre of war there are euphemisms. Here the euphemism was the system. You can measure cruelty by the reactions of the newly freed. Some women hid from their liberators, expecting the cannibal myths they'd been fed to come true. Some clutched grenades they'd been issued for honor. Some asked, in a voice that didn't rise above a whisper, whether they would be punished for work refusal if they spoke. The first job for the medics was triage: malnutrition, infections, injuries that never got to scab over. The second job didn't exist yet: trauma care, a vocabulary no one in uniform had been trained to speak. The camera crews that followed the infantry took clinical pictures: narrow cubicles, army blankets, exam tables, boxes of condoms stamped with supply codes. They weren't making a case for a future court. They were filling out a record for an army that needed to understand what it had found. But evidence has a way of ripening in the dark. Decades later, those stark frames, uncomposed, fluorescent, harsh, would be the strips of cellulose that made denial impossible. By the fall, translators' tents turned into factories. Reports stacked, and a research memo titled "Amenities in the Japanese Armed Forces" grew from a few dozen pages to a compendium as thick as a field manual. Annexes reproduced regulations verbatim: schedules, penalties, procurement chains. Somewhere in the small print, a clerk had written licensed prostitutes, as if a stamp could legalize the absence of consent. Bureaucracy would be the thing that betrayed the machine that built it. It's tempting, in hindsight, to imagine judgment marching in formation. In 1944, it didn't. Units had orders to seize ports, hills, crossroads. No one had a standard operating procedure for dismantling an empire of organized rape. The soldiers did what they could: break locks, feed the hungry, get the sick to an aid station, write down what they saw. The women did what they had always done: survive the next hour. Here is the paradox of that year. The more routine the paperwork looked, the more monstrous the routine became. And as the front shifted toward the Philippines, the ledger would grow longer, the rooms more numerous, the evidence harder to catalogue before it drowned the desks meant to hold it. Beat to hold, for video pacing. The Yunnan photograph stays on screen an extra 3 seconds. The pregnant woman blinks. A soldier's hand gestures toward the horizon. The narrator's breath is audible once before we move. Manila had already suffered 3 years of occupation when American columns punched through to Santo Tomas. The city's map, market districts, university grounds, river bends, would soon carry another layer: addresses where comfort stations had operated. 12 in Manila alone by the count of occupation records, more across Luzon and the Visayas. The infantry didn't go hunting for them. They found them because the war had put them everywhere. The financial paperwork outlived the walls. Paymasters' ledgers divided men by rank and women by nati. On 2 yen for a private, 3 for an NCO, officers by arrangement. On another page, charges for food, for clothing, for the medicine that sometimes burned more than it healed. The arithmetic always ended the same way: debt. If you wanted a single page that explained how control sustains itself, you could point to the ledger and say, this. One name that would not be written publicly for half a century, Maria Rosa Luna Henson, was a teenager when the system swallowed her. Guerrillas reached her first before the Americans returned in force and folded her into a network designed to save lives in a war that devoured them casually. She would carry silence like a second spine for decades, then stand and speak when the world had finally developed a grammar that could listen. The Philippines taught the liberators a difficult truth: rescue is a moment, recognition is a process. And then came Okinawa. On a strip of land barely 70 miles long, the numbers exploded. 17 former stations in Naha alone, caves used as hiding places when concrete and wood were too visible. Marines moving through karst and brush stumbled upon women who had been told death was better than capture, who were handed grenades as if honor were a mechanical thing you could perform like a drill. There is nothing tidy about meeting someone whose every choice has been engineered against them. The only tidy thing left is the paperwork, and there was plenty of it. By May, translation teams worked around the clock under tarps and blackout curtains, turning registers and orders into English. Duty rosters revealed quotas that make the voice falter when read out loud: 30 men in a day, 40 in a surge. Medical logs noted pregnancies ended because the timetable of invasion had no room for infants. The phrases were still careful. The reality had run out of care a long time ago. A quiet set of heroes, the Nisei linguists, made this record possible. Sons of immigrants, some with families behind barbed wire on the mainland, sat with clipboards in the humid dark and gave shape to what the army had found. When a Korean woman, forbidden from her language for so long she tripped over her own words, looked away from a male translator, a female volunteer stepped in. When a Dutch survivor didn't have words that fit the forms, a bilingual nurse tried to invent a space where the truth could survive the translation. The archive we point to now exists because these people insisted that meaning survive alongside fact. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke in detail after the war. Libraries would later note the absence. You can guess at the reasons. Some forms of witnessing sit like a weight you decide not to set down in public. Some silences begin because no one asks the right question in time. Some absences exist because the women who could have confirmed a story didn't live long enough to be found. If this were just a chronology, this is where we'd roll a map and draw arrows toward the Dutch East Indies. But the shape of the story shifts here. Liberation exposes the system. The end of fighting does not end the system's consequences. That requires something armies don't carry in supply columns, justice that speaks to the human heart and the cultural wound. The camera tilts. We move. Java in 1944 fits in too easily beside other place names, but the particulars matter. A group of Dutch women taken from an internment camp is moved under guard to a house that used to belong to a family. Furniture repurposed, doors locked, rules posted. A young woman named Jan Ruff O'Hearn will one day write about it with a restraint that makes the reader's throat tighten. She will testify in a different century, before a different Congress. The interval between those two acts, end, urance and speech, measures how long it takes for a world to develop ears. British and Australian units moving through the archipelago recorded what they found the way soldiers do: grid coordinates, head counts, supply notes, repatriation priorities. Meanwhile, colonial administrations returned and, out of shame, out of the politics of power, out of 100 bad reasons, boxed some truths in filing cabinets. For protection, they said. But protection for whom is a question archives return to like a wound that never closes clean. Repatriation was an ocean of logistics. UNRWA staffers in khaki set up way stations, fed lines of refugees, matched names to manifests. The numbers were staggering. Millions moved in weeks. The system worked for the problems it understood: soldiers, POWs, civilian internees. But there was no category for what the women had been made to become. Without a box to check, people disappear. They go to the end of the line. They accept a blanket and a cup and keep their eyes on the ground. Cultural gravity did the rest. In Confucian homes, a daughter's body could be her family's honor. In Catholic barrios, violation could mean exile from the people who should hold you. In villages guided by Islamic custom, a stigma could spread like a stain everyone pretends not to see. Some women chose new names in new towns. Some married because marriage was the only protection on offer. Some stayed where they had been enslaved because going home meant facing a mirror that everyone else would hold up like a weapon. The map of liberation routes doesn't show those roads. You learn them by listening. Medicine in 1945 could stop an infection that would have killed a woman in 1942. It could not yet name post-traumatic stress in a way that would unlock resources. The charts said hysteria, melancholia, nervous exhaustion. The words were wrong, but they were the only words. Doctors had. A generation later, researchers would measure rates of PTSD so high they would redraw our understanding of long-shadowed harm. By then, many of the first patients were gone. The law moved unevenly. A court in the Netherlands-controlled Indies tried a handful of officers and noted, starkly, that the crime had a name. Elsewhere, the biggest courtroom in the theatre addressed the subject once in passing. Silence at that height becomes policy by omission. Survivors read the headline, "War Ends," and discover a footnote, "Your suffering will be administratively inconvenient indefinitely." And still, paper kept surfacing: diaries, orders, memos about recreation, banking trails from puppet regimes that itemized purchases as if human beings were tools. In another decade, a professor would open a file in a defense archive and find a sentence that should have been common knowledge. In another, a congressional resolution in a distant country would urge acknowledgement. Recognition is a relay. The baton passes hand to hand slowly, then suddenly. Between those baton passes, a photograph continues to exist. A woman continues to live under a name that changes shape in her mouth when she tries to say it to her children. A translator's pencil annotation in the margin, "This clause implies coercion," turns out to be a hinge, the whole door swings on years later. The geography of silence includes cabinets and customs, but it also includes living rooms and the spaces between parents and their grown children, where histories sit, unspoken, heavy as furniture no one admits is there. When survivors began to speak publicly in the early 1990s, some listeners reacted as if they were hearing a new story. It wasn't new. It had been photographed, translated, requisitioned, logged. The difference was not in evidence, but in attention. Attention had finally learned the vocabulary that evidence demanded. Here is what makes this history uniquely undeniable. The banality of it, as documentation. This was not horror you can dismiss as rumor of war. This was horror with page numbers, opening hours, medical rotations, transport authorizations, disposable orders, most chilling of all, that instructed subordinates to eliminate witnesses as Allied forces approached. Massacres are improvised, policy is typed. Armies win wars, archives win arguments with time. The Signal Corps negatives, the intelligence annexes, the ledgers and clinic cards outlived the people who wrote them. When a woman stood at a microphone in Seoul or Manila, in Taipei or The Hague, and described being moved like cargo and inspected like gear, the archive rose to meet her voice. Yes, it said, we already recorded the shape of this truth while the smoke was still in the air. Why didn't soldiers speak more? Some did, privately. Some couldn't. The absence is instructive. Liberation was visible. What the women had endured was invisible by design. The men who kicked doors and carried stretchers understood courage as movement under fire. They didn't have a ritual for bearing witness to a system that weaponized shame. That doesn't make them complicit. It makes them human within the limits of their training and their time. For a YouTube audience, young, far from the 1940s, saturated with short videos, you build retention by being honest about complexity without drowning people in dates. You keep a thread. Liberation is a beginning, not an end. You loop visuals that carry emotional weight, the Yunnan photograph, a ledger column that totals to debt, a cave mouth on Okinawa with sunlight slicing in. You return to the faces, but you do not exploit them. You say names where history allows you to, and you respect privacy where it doesn't. In the present tense, memorials stand in plazas and parks. Some are contested because memory always is. Laws are debated. Textbooks are revised by inches. Few, than a handful of original survivors, remain to give living testimony. That should focus the mind. The task is no longer to discover the truth. It is to refuse to let it be misfiled again. What remains to be done? 3 things, and they work for an audience and for a conscience. First, precision. Words matter. Comfort was the lie. Say sexual slavery, forced prostitution under military control, industrialized rape. Use the documented vocabulary the system accidentally provided. Second, proximity. Bring the viewer close enough to feel the ordinary textures, paper fibers, stamp ink, the squeak of a metal cot, so they understand how horror hides in processes, not just in outbursts. Third, persistence. Endings that sound neat betray the subject. The right close is a door left ajar with light showing, an invitation to learn one more name, to read one more page, to believe one more testimony. Closing narration. Hold on image of Park Young-sim walking toward the camera. They told her Americans would eat her. Instead, a soldier handed her water. He did not have a word for what had happened to her, but he had a camera and a form and a pen. Decades later, when she said her name into a microphone, the photograph and the paperwork stepped forward like witnesses who had been waiting at the back of the room for their turn to speak. Liberation began with a door opening. Justice is still walking down the hall.